Hey everyone, and welcome to your personalized deep dive.
I love that name.
Thanks. Today we're going to crack open the psychology book, which covers so much ground.
It really does. It's like a psychology library all in one volume.
Yeah, we've got ancient Greece to modern day neuroscience all packed in here, so get ready for some serious brain food.
It's going to be a feast.
To help us navigate this massive amount of information, we've got the amazing expert speaker here with us.
Happy to be here.
And they are like the master of making sense of these like really complex ideas and, connecting the dots between like all these different schools of thought and thinkers.
I try my best.
So we're going to like extract the most fascinating and relevant nuggets from this book.
The golden nuggets.
Yes. Think of it as a cheat sheet to understanding the human mind.
I like it.
Okay. Are you ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
Okay. Let's start with something everyone's fascinated by: personality.
A perfect place to begin. And speaking of beginnings, our first stop takes us all the way back to ancient Rome with Galen and his 4 temperaments of personality.
Okay. So before we had Myers-Briggs and BuzzFeed quizzes, the Romans had bodily fluids. Tell me more about this.
Well, it's based on this ancient Greek idea of humorism.
Humorism.
Yeah. It's the belief that our health and personality are determined by the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and Galen built upon this, linking each humor to a specific temperament: sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, and melancholic.
So let's say I have an excess of black bile. What does that say about me? Aside from needing a good doctor, of course.
Well, that would make you the melancholic type.
Melancholic.
Yeah. Introspective, thoughtful, perhaps prone to sadness, but also often very creative and deep thinkers.
Interesting.
Of course, the idea that bodily fluids dictate our personality is outdated.
Right.
But what's fascinating is that these basic personality types or archetypes still resonate today. Even modern personality theories often echo these categories, though our understanding of their origins has changed drastically.
That is so cool. It's like a through line across centuries of trying to figure out what makes people tick.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder, if these temperaments have stuck around for so long, is there something fundamentally true about them? Maybe these categories capture something essential about human nature. But let's move on from bodily fluids to something perhaps even more mysterious: the mind-body problem.
Ah, yes. The mind-body problem. This has plagued philosophers and scientists for centuries, and one of the most influential figures in this debate was René Descartes,
Descartes.
a
All right.
17th century philosopher, and he argued for mind-body dualism.
Dualism.
Yeah, the idea that the mind and body are separate entities, with the mind, or soul, being non-material but somehow interacting with the physical body.
And he even pinpointed the pineal gland in the brain as the seat of the soul.
Right.
I find it fascinating that even back then they were trying to locate like where our thoughts and feelings come from.
It's amazing, isn't it?
But how does this dualistic view hold up with our current understanding of neuroscience? It seems like everything we think and feel stems from the physical processes in our brains.
Yeah, you're hitting on a point of contention. While Descartes' ideas were revolutionary for his time, they've been challenged by modern neuroscience.
Okay.
Today, we see the mind as an emergent property of the brain.
Emergent property.
Yeah, it's not a separate entity, but rather a product of all those complex neural networks firing away.
Okay.
Think of it this way. Your personality, your memories, your very sense of self all arise from the intricate dance of neurons in your brain.
That's incredible. It really makes you appreciate the complexity of the human brain.
For sure.
Okay. Are you ready for another big question that has fascinated thinkers for ages? Let's dive into the age-old debate: nature versus nurture.
Oh, this debate's a classic for a reason.
Yeah.
It cuts to the core of who we are and how we become ourselves.
Right.
One key figure in this debate is Francis Galton, a 19th century scientist who focused on inherited traits. His book, Hereditary Genius, argued that talent and intelligence run in families.
Hereditary genius.
Yeah, he looked at lineages filled with exceptional individuals and proposed that genius was, to a large extent, passed down genetically.
But didn't he come from a pretty privileged family himself? It seems like that could have skewed his perspective a bit. It's hard to separate out like the advantages a nurturing environment provides from someone's inherent potential, isn't it?
You're right, that's one of the main criticisms of Galton's work.
Yeah.
He didn't fully account for environmental influences.
Right.
Today, most psychologists recognize that both nature and nurture play significant roles in shaping who we are.
Yeah.
It's not a simple either scenario.
Right. It's fascinating how this debate applies to so many aspects of our lives, isn't it? I mean, think about something like addiction. Are some people predisposed to addiction because of their genes? Or is it more about their environment and the choices they make? It seems like untangling the threads of nature and nurture is a challenge we're still grappling with.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's this intricate interplay of genes and environment that makes us who we are.
Right.
And while we've made great strides in understanding these factors, the debate is far from settled.
Okay, I'm ready for a journey into something a bit more mystical. Let's talk about hypnotism.
Excellent choice. The history of hypnosis is full of fascinating figures and unexpected connections. Have you ever heard of Abbé Faria?
Vaguely, but refresh my memory.
Ah.
Who was he and what's his connection to hypnotism?
Faria was a Portuguese priest in the late 18th and early 19th centuries who was fascinated by trance states.
Okay.
What's particularly interesting is that he saw a link between these states and the healing practices of ancient sleep temples.
Wait, sleep temples, what were those?
Imagine ancient sanctuaries in places like Egypt and Greece,
Okay.
where people would go to seek healing through altered states of consciousness. They believed that these trance-like states had the power to promote healing. Furia, centuries later, was essentially building on these ancient traditions.
That's a mind-blowing connection. So how did Faya contribute to our modern understanding of hypnotism?
He helped to demystify trance states,
Okay.
explaining how they could be induced and used for therapeutic purposes.
Interesting.
Faria really set the stage for later figures like Charcot and even Freud to explore the power of suggestion in treating psychological issues.
It's amazing to see how ancient practices are echoed in modern therapies. I
Yeah.
mean, we still use hypnosis today for things like pain management and psychotherapy. Speaking of Freud, we can't talk about psychology without mentioning the unconscious mind, can we? It's such a mind-boggling concept, the idea that there's this hidden part of ourselves operating beneath the surface, influencing our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
It really is.
It's crazy.
Freud's theory of the unconscious was truly groundbreaking.
Yeah.
He proposed that this hidden realm within us is a powerful force, shaping us in ways we don't even realize.
Right.
And while some of his specific ideas have been debated and revised over time, the concept of the unconscious remains central to psychology.
Okay, so give me a concrete example of the unconscious at work. I've always been fascinated by Freudian slips.
Oh,
Like when you accidentally call your teacher mom.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Freudian slips or parapraxis are classic example.
Praxis.
Yeah, they're those little slips of the tongue that supposedly reveal a hidden thought or desire.
Right.
It's like our unconscious is peeking through the cracks of our conscious mind. And then, of course, we have dreams.
Yes.
Freud saw dreams as the royal road to the unconscious, filled with symbolic language and repressed desires.
It's like our brains are putting on a cryptic play for us every night, and we have to try to decipher the message. Makes you wonder what else is lurking down there in the depths of our unconscious.
I know. That's the mystery that continues to fascinate psychologists today.
Totally.
And while we may never fully unlock all the secrets of the unconscious, Freud's work gave us a whole new way of understanding the human mind and its hidden depths.
This deep dive is already making me question everything I thought I knew about myself. Okay, ready for an experiment that might make you question your own perceptions?
Let's do it. Let's talk about Solomon Asch and his groundbreaking work on social conformity.
I've heard of this. It's the one where people are shown lines at different lengths, right?
Yeah.
But tell me more. I'm all ears.
Exactly. Asch designed these experiments to explore how social pressure influences our perceptions and judgments.
Right.
He put participants in groups and showed them a series of lines, asking them to match a target line to one of 3 comparison lines. The catch: everyone in the group except the actual participant was in on the experiment and instructed to give obviously wrong answers.
Wait, so they were all intentionally giving the wrong answers? And what happened? Did the real participants go along with it?
Believe it or not, they often did.
Really?
Even though the correct answer was clear, the pressure to conform to the group's response was strong enough to make them doubt their own perceptions.
That's wild. It
Yeah.
makes you wonder how often we do that in everyday life.
Right.
Have you ever gone along with something you knew wasn't right just because everyone else was doing it? I know I have.
I think we all has at some point.
Yeah.
Asch's experiments really highlight the power of social influence and how easily we can be swayed by the opinions of others, even when we know better. It makes you think about how much of what we believe is truly our own,
Right.
and how much is shaped by the social forces around us.
It's a bit unsettling, isn't it? The thought that we're not always as independent in our thinking as we might believe. But it also explains a lot about group dynamics and why it can be so hard to go against the grain. Okay, ready to shift gears and talk about a revolution in psychology.
I'm always up for a revolution. Let's delve into the fascinating world of cognitive psychology.
Perfect. So how did cognitive psychology shake things up? Was it a sudden paradigm shift?
It was a gradual shift, but a significant one nonetheless.
Hmm.
Cognitive psychology emerged in the mid-20th century as a response to the limitations of behaviorism, which focused solely on observable behaviors. Cognitive psychologists argued that to truly understand the human mind, we needed to understand the mental processes happening inside, things like memory, perception, and problem solving. They saw the brain as an information processor, kind of like a computer.
So instead of just looking at what people do, they wanted to understand the why behind those actions. It's like trying to understand how a computer program works instead of just seeing what shows up on the screen.
Exactly. And this shift led to a wealth of research on how we think, learn, and remember.
Hmm.
But what's really interesting is that some researchers, like Bluma Zygarnik, were already exploring these cognitive processes decades before the so-called cognitive revolution.
Bluma Zygarnik. Tell me more about her and her work.
Zygarnik is known for discovering what's now called the Zygarnik effect.
Okay.
It describes the tendency to remember unfinished or interrupted tasks better than completed ones.
Wait, really? That sounds counterintuitive. Why would we remember the things we haven't finished better than the things we have?
Think about it this way. You start a project at work, but you get pulled away to handle another task.
Uh-huh.
That unfinished project keeps nagging at your brain,
Yes.
demanding your attention.
Right.
It's like your brain creates a mental tension that lingers until you've closed the loop.
Hmm.
This tension makes the memory of that unfinished task stick around longer.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
It's like my to-do list is constantly haunting me, even when I'm trying to relax.
Exactly. It's a fascinating quirk of memory that highlights how our minds are constantly working, even when we're not consciously aware of it.
Yeah.
And speaking of the fallibility of memory, are you ready for some research that might make you question everything you thought you knew about your own past?
Bring it on. I'm ready to have my mind blown again.
Then let's talk about the groundbreaking work of Elizabeth Loftus.
Oh.
Our research has revealed that our memories are not always as reliable as we might believe.
Hmm.
In fact, they can be distorted and even implanted through suggestion and misinformation.
Implanted memories. That sounds straight out of science fiction. Are you saying it's possible to have memories of events that never actually happened?
It might sound unbelievable,
Yeah.
but Loftus's research has demonstrated that it is in fact possible.
Wow.
She's done extensive work on eyewitness testimony, and her findings are quite shocking.
Okay.
She's shown how leading questions, suggestive language, and even the way information is framed can all influence our memories.
That's incredibly unsettling, especially when you think about the implications for the legal system.
Right?
I mean, how much of what people claim to remember is accurate? And how do we know if a memory is real or implanted?
Those are the very questions that Loftus's work forces us to confront.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder that our memories are not perfect recordings of the past.
Hmm.
They're malleable and susceptible to influence. And this knowledge has had a profound impact on how we view eyewitness testimony and the reliability of memory in legal cases.
This whole deep dive is making me question everything I thought I knew about the human mind. And we're just getting started. There's so much more to explore in the psychology book.
You're right, we've only scratched the surface, but I
Yeah.
think we've given our listeners a solid foundation to build upon.
Okay.
Next, we'll delve into some even more challenging and thought-provoking ideas.
Stay tuned, folks, because the journey into the human mind continues in part 2. Welcome back to our deep dive into the psychology book.
Where we're continuing our exploration of the incredible complexities of the human mind.
Last time we left off with this unsettling idea that memories can be distorted or even implanted.
Right.
It makes you realize that what we perceive as reality is often filtered through our own subjective experiences and biases.
It's a humbling realization, isn't it? And speaking of challenging conventional views, let's talk about a movement that really shook up the world of psychiatry. The anti-psychiatry movement.
Okay. Anti-psychiatry. That sounds intense. Break it down for me. What were they questioning?
The anti-psychiatry movement gained momentum in the 1960s
Okay.
and challenged many traditional views of mental illness. Figures like R.D. Laing argued that what we label as madness or mental illness might not be a disease at all, but rather a sane reaction to an insane world.
So instead of seeing certain behaviors as symptoms of a disorder, They saw them as a way of coping with societal pressures
Mm.
or a form of rebellion against societal norms.
Exactly. They questioned the medicalization of mental distress and the power dynamics inherent in the doctor-patient relationship.
Mhm.
Lang, for example, argued that what we call schizophrenia might actually be a breakthrough of sorts, a way of breaking free from the constraints of a society that is itself dysfunctional.
That's such a different perspective. Instead of trying to fix people who are deemed mentally ill, they were advocating for understanding and validating their experiences.
Right.
It makes you wonder how much of what we label as mental illness is truly pathological and how much is simply a different way of being in the world.
That's a question that continues to spark debate in the field of mental health.
Yeah.
And while the anti-psychiatry movement was controversial, it brought some important issues to light, forcing us to reconsider our assumptions about mental illness and the ways we treat it.
It's definitely thought-provoking. And speaking of challenging assumptions, let's talk about another fascinating figure from this movement, Boris Cyrulnik.
Oh, Sir Olnick.
His work on resilience is truly inspiring. What drew him to study resilience?
Cyrulnik was interested in understanding why some people seem to thrive in the face of adversity, while others crumble under pressure.
Right.
He was particularly fascinated by children who had endured incredibly traumatic experiences,
Okay.
war, abuse, neglect,
Wow.
but who somehow managed to not only survive but also flourish.
So resilience isn't just about being tough or having a never-give-up attitude. It's about something more profound, right?
Exactly. Cyrulnik found that resilience is not something you're born with,
Hmm.
but something you develop over time through experience and relationships.
Okay.
He uses a beautiful metaphor to describe this process. He compares human beings to a knitted fabric. Our lives are made up of all these interconnected threads of relationships, experiences, and events.
Hmm.
And even if some of those threads break, we can still weave ourselves back together, find new connections, and continue to grow.
That's a powerful image.
Yeah,
It reminds us that even when we face hardships, we have the capacity to heal and rebuild our lives.
right.
It's not about erasing the past, but about integrating it into our present and future.
Precisely. And Cyrulnik's work highlights the importance of social support, love, and connection in building resilience. It's about finding meaning in our struggles and using our experiences to grow stronger.
Okay, switching gears a bit, I'm curious to learn more about intelligence.
Okay.
We've touched on the nature versus nurture debate, but there's so much more to explore.
For sure.
And I've heard that there are over 150 types of intelligence. That sounds mind-boggling.
It is mind-boggling, and the person we have to thank or perhaps blame for this explosion of intelligence types is J.P. Guilford. Yeah, he challenged the traditional idea of a single general intelligence, often referred to as the G factor,
Okay.
which was popularized by earlier researchers like Charles Spearman.
Spearmint, okay.
So instead of just one type of intelligence, Guilford thought there were over 150 distinct abilities at play.
So instead of just one type of intelligence, Guilford thought there were over 150 distinct abilities at play. How did he even begin to categorize all of that?
He proposed a complex model of intelligence known as the structure of intellect.
The structure of intellect.
This model involves three main dimensions:
Okay.
operations, content, and products.
Okay.
Operations refer to the mental processes we use. Content refers to the types of information we process.
Okay.
And products are the outcomes of our thinking.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
Can you give me a concrete example to illustrate these dimensions?
Imagine you're working on a crossword puzzle.
Okay.
The operation might be your ability to think of synonyms or to recognize patterns in the clues.
Right.
The content would be the verbal information, the words and definitions.
Okay.
And the product would be the completed puzzle, the solution you've arrived at through your mental effort.
I see. So instead of simply measuring a single IQ score, Guilford argued that we should be assessing all these different abilities separately.
Exactly. And while his model was extremely complex and difficult to test in its entirety,
Right.
it had a significant impact on how we think about intelligence.
Mm.
It broadened our understanding of what constitutes intelligence and challenged the notion that it's a single, fixed trait.
It makes you wonder if those standardized IQ tests we all dreaded in school really captured the full spectrum of our abilities.
Right.
Maybe there are all sorts of intelligences that go unnoticed or unmeasured.
That's a question worth pondering.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the limitations of any attempt to measure something as complex and multifaceted as human intelligence.
Okay, well, I feel a bit better knowing that my IQ score might not be the be-all and end-all of my intellectual capabilities. Now, I'm curious to learn more about personality traits.
Okay.
What are they, and how do they shape who we are?
Great question. Personality traits are enduring patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that distinguish us from one another.
Okay.
They're relatively stable over time and across different situations.
Hmm.
One of the pioneers in the study of personality traits was Gordon Allport.
All poor.
So before Allport, how did psychologists understand personality?
I don't know. Tell me.
Well, the prevailing theories were behaviorism and psychoanalysis.
Okay.
Behaviorists, as you might imagine, focused on how our environment and experiences shape our behavior.
Right.
Psychoanalysts, on the other hand, delved into the unconscious mind and the impact of early childhood experiences on personality development.
Okay.
But Allport felt like something was missing.
Hmm.
He wanted to focus on the individual and what made each person unique.
He was looking for those core characteristics that make someone who they are, regardless of their past experiences or their environment.
Exactly. Allport believed that traits are real, not just theoretical constructs. They're the building blocks of personality, influencing how we perceive the world, interact with others, and make decisions.
Right.
He also distinguished between central traits,
Central traits.
which are the most defining characteristics of a person,
Okay.
and secondary traits, which are more situation-specific and less consistent.
So, for example, someone who is generally outgoing and sociable, that would be a central trait.
Yes.
But maybe they get nervous and quiet in large groups. That could be a secondary trait.
Exactly. And Allport's work was groundbreaking in emphasizing the importance of individual differences and moving away from these one-size-fits-all explanations of personality.
Okay, so how did Allport go about identifying all these different traits? Did he have people take personality tests, or was there another method he used?
His approach was quite unique.
Right.
He started by digging into the dictionary, literally.
Wow.
He and his colleague Henry Odbert went through the entire dictionary and identified over 4,500 words that described personality traits.
That's a lot of work.
From there, they narrowed it down to a smaller set of core traits.
Wow, talk about dedication.
Yeah,
Going through the entire dictionary, that's impressive.
it is.
It shows how committed he was to establishing personality psychology as a legitimate scientific field.
Absolutely. And his work laid the groundwork for later researchers who developed more refined models of personality, like Raymond Tittel and Hans Eysenck.
Okay, let's talk about those models. I've heard of Kettel's 16 personality factor questionnaire.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
Kettel used a statistical technique called factor analysis
Okay.
to identify 16 underlying personality traits like warmth, dominance, and emotional stability. His questionnaire is still widely used today to assess personality and understand individual differences.
And what about Eysenck's model?
Eysenck focused on 3 core dimensions of personality: extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism.
Okay.
He believed that these dimensions capture the most important aspects of personality and that they have a biological basis, meaning they're influenced by our genes and temperament.
So our personality is predetermined by our genes. That sounds a bit deterministic, doesn't it?
It's not quite that simple. Like most things in psychology, it's a complex interplay of nature and nurture.
Right.
Eysenck's model emphasizes the biological underpinnings of personality, but he also acknowledged the role of environment and experience.
So it's not about being boxed in by our genes, but about understanding how our biological predispositions interact with our environment to shape who we are.
Exactly.
It's about recognizing the complexity of human nature.
Absolutely. And these models, while helpful for understanding personality, are just tools.
Right.
They don't define us completely.
Yeah.
We're all unique, and our personalities are constantly evolving as we interact with the world around us.
Okay, that's a reassuring thought. Now let's talk about how we measure intelligence in children.
Okay.
I've heard of the Stanford-Binet intelligence scales. What's the history behind this test?
It all started with Alfred Binet, a French psychologist who, in the early 1900s, was tasked with developing a way to identify children who might need extra educational support. His test was groundbreaking because it focused on mental abilities, not just rote learning.
So instead of simply testing how much a child had memorized, Binet was interested in assessing their problem-solving skills, their ability to reason and think critically.
Exactly. And this was a radical departure from the prevailing views of intelligence at the time.
Wow.
Binet's test measured things like verbal comprehension, memory, and problem-solving skills that are essential for academic success.
And how did Binet's test evolve into the Stanford-Binet we know today?
A psychologist at Stanford University named Louis Terman adapted and standardized Binet's test for American children.
Okay.
That's where the Stanford part comes in.
Okay.
Terman also introduced the concept of the intelligence quotient, or IQ.
Yes, IQ. That three-letter number that has followed many of us around since childhood, for better or worse. It's become so ingrained in our culture that it's hard to escape its influence.
It's true, but it's crucial to remember that IQ is just a score on a test.
Yeah.
It's not a comprehensive measure of intelligence, and it certainly doesn't define a person's worth or potential.
It's a good reminder that there's so much more to intelligence than what can be captured on a standardized test. Speaking of challenging conventional views, I'm curious to learn more about Thomas Szasz and his book, The Myth of Mental Illness.
Uh-huh.
He seems like a pretty radical thinker.
Szasz was definitely a controversial figure.
Yeah.
He argued that mental illness is a myth, a social construct, not a real disease.
That's a bold statement. So instead of viewing mental illness as a medical condition, he saw it as...
He believed that what we call mental illness is often just a way of labeling behaviors or ways of thinking that society deems unacceptable or deviant.
Okay.
He argued that these problems in living, as he called them,
Problems in living.
are not diseases that need to be cured, but rather challenges that individuals face as they navigate the complexities of life.
So instead of medicalizing mental distress, he thought we should be focusing on the social and cultural factors that contribute to people's suffering. It seems like his views align with the anti-psychiatry movement in some ways.
You're right, there are definitely some overlaps.
Yeah.
Both Zaz and the anti-psychiatry movement question the authority of psychiatry and the way it medicalizes human experience.
Mhm.
And while Saz's views were and still are controversial, they raise some important questions about how we define and treat mental illness.
It's definitely a perspective that makes you think critically about the boundaries between what's considered normal and abnormal, and how those boundaries are often fluid and influenced by cultural norms.
For sure.
Okay, I'm ready for a dose of positivity. Let's talk about happiness.
Yeah.
What can psychology teach us about living a fulfilling life?
That's where positive psychology comes in.
Okay.
Martin Seligman, one of the founders of this field,
Hmm.
felt like psychology had become too focused on what's wrong with people, on mental illness, trauma, and dysfunction.
Hmm.
He wanted to shift the focus to what makes life worth living, to understand the factors that contribute to happiness, well-being, and flourishing.
So instead of just fixing what's broken, positive psychology is about building a good life,
Yes.
about cultivating those qualities that allow us to thrive.
Exactly. It's about understanding our strengths, nurturing positive emotions, building resilience, and finding meaning and purpose.
That sounds amazing.
Mm.
But how do we actually achieve this good life? What are the key ingredients?
Seligman and other positive psychologists have identified several key elements.
Okay.
One is positive emotions experiencing joy, gratitude, love, and contentment.
Okay.
But it's not just about feeling good all the time.
Right.
It's also about engagement, getting lost in activities that challenge us and utilize our strengths.
Mm.
And finally, it's about feeling like our lives have purpose and that we're contributing to something larger than ourselves.
It sounds like finding that sweet spot where we're engaged in meaningful activities that bring us joy and a sense of purpose. That's a great aspiration, but it also sounds like a lot of work. Is there a shortcut to happiness?
There's no magic bullet, unfortunately.
Ah.
It's an ongoing journey of self-discovery and growth.
Hmm.
But by understanding the science of happiness and well-being, we can make choices that lead us in the right direction.
So it's about being intentional with our lives and making choices that align with our values and aspirations.
Exactly.
I like that. Okay, shifting gears again. I've always been fascinated by social influence.
Okay.
How easily can we be persuaded by others?
Yeah.
And what are the factors that make someone persuasive?
That's a question that has kept social psychologists busy for decades. There are so many factors at play, from the message itself to the characteristics of the persuader.
So is it all about having a charismatic personality, or is there more to it? I'm imagining someone like a skilled salesperson who can convince anyone to buy anything.
Charisma can definitely play a role, but it's not the only factor.
Okay.
One of the most important elements is credibility,
Oh.
how trustworthy and knowledgeable the persuader is perceived to be. If we trust the source of information, we're more likely to be persuaded by their message.
That makes sense. We're more likely to believe someone we perceive as an expert or authority figure. But what about the message itself? What makes a message persuasive?
A truly persuasive message often appeals to both our heads and our hearts.
Okay.
It needs to be logically sound, of course,
Right.
but it also needs to resonate with us on an emotional level.
Mm.
Think about those commercials that tug at your heartstrings. They're trying to evoke an emotional response that will make you more receptive to their message.
It's like they're bypassing our rational mind and going straight for our emotions.
Right.
And that can be pretty powerful, especially when it comes to advertising and marketing.
It's true, and this brings up another important point. The role of critical thinking in navigating the world of persuasion. With the constant bombardment of information we face today, it's more important than ever to be able to evaluate information critically, question sources, and recognize biases.
Absolutely. It's like we need to develop our own internal BS detector to filter out the noise and myth information that surrounds us.
I love that analogy.
Okay, ready for one final mind-blowing concept before we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Bring it on. I think I know just the one.
Let's talk about cognitive dissonance. It's a term I've heard thrown around, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
Cognitive dissonance, a term coined by Leon Festinger,
Festinger.
refers to the mental discomfort we feel when our beliefs clash with our actions or when we hold two conflicting beliefs simultaneously.
Okay, so give me an example. How does this play out in real life?
Let's say someone believes that smoking is harmful,
Okay.
but they continue to smoke.
Mm.
This creates cognitive dissonance, a clash between their belief and their behavior.
Ah, I see. So how do people deal with this discomfort? Do they just ignore it, or is there a way to resolve it?
There are a few ways to reduce cognitive dissonance.
Okay.
One is to change our behavior to align with our beliefs, in this case, quitting smoking. Another is to change our beliefs to justify our behavior, for example, convincing ourselves that smoking isn't that bad,
Uh-huh.
or that we'll quit eventually.
So it's like our minds are trying to create a sense of internal consistency, even if it means distorting reality or rationalizing our actions. That's fascinating, but also a bit unsettling.
It's a powerful force, and it can have both positive and negative consequences.
Right.
On the one hand, it can motivate us to make positive changes in our lives. But on the other hand, it can lead to self-deception and denial.
It's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
We need to be aware of its influence so we can use it to our advantage rather than letting it sabotage our efforts to live authentically.
Exactly. And I think that's a great takeaway from this part of our deep dive. Understanding the complexities of the human mind, from our unconscious motivations to the ways we rationalize our behavior, can empower us to make more conscious and informed choices.
Well said. This has been a mind-expanding journey so far.
It has.
But don't go anywhere just yet, because we have one more part to go. We'll be exploring the philosophical roots of psychology and wrapping up our deep dive into the psychology book.
Stay tuned for the grand finale.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the worlds of psychology.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From ancient theories of personality to the complexities of the unconscious mind, the power of social influence, and the quest for happiness.
It's been quite a journey. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to take a step back and look at the philosophical foundations of psychology.
Okay.
Where did this whole field come from? What were the early thinkers grappling with that laid the groundwork for modern psychology?
Excellent point. To understand psychology, we have to understand its roots in philosophy.
Right.
Long before psychology was a formal science, philosophers were asking questions about the nature of the mind, consciousness, and how we come to know the world.
So we're talking about the big questions of existence.
Yeah.
Who are we? What is the nature of reality? How do we perceive and understand the world around us? Those are some heavy topics.
They are indeed, and these questions have occupied philosophers for centuries. But when it comes to the birth of psychology as a distinct discipline, there's one figure who stands out. Wilhelm Wundt. He's often considered the father of experimental psychology, the one who truly established psychology as a science.
So he took psychology out of the realm of philosophical speculation and brought it into the laboratory.
Precisely. In 1879, he founded the first experimental psychology laboratory at the University of Leipzig in Germany.
Wow.
This was a pivotal moment. It marked the beginning of psychology as a science based on empirical evidence and controlled experiments.
That's fascinating. So what kind of experiments was Wundt conducting in this lab? What was he trying to understand?
Wundt was primarily interested in studying consciousness, the subjective experience of our inner world.
Okay.
He used a method called introspection,
Introspection.
which involves carefully observing and reporting on one's own thoughts and feelings. He trained his students to become expert introspectors, to pay close attention to their mental processes and describe them in detail.
So it was like mindfulness, but in a very rigorous and scientific setting.
You could say that, but Wundt's approach was highly systematic.
Okay.
He wanted to break down consciousness into its basic elements, much like a chemist analyzes the components of a compound.
Uh-huh.
He believed that by understanding the building blocks of consciousness, we could understand the mind itself.
It's like he was trying to create a periodic table of the mind, mapping out all the different elements of our inner experience. But how did this approach to psychology evolve over time? Did everyone agree with Wundt's method of introspection?
Not everyone was convinced that introspection was a reliable way to study the mind.
Okay.
Some psychologists felt it was too subjective, too dependent on individual interpretation.
Right.
And that's where figures like William James come in.
Yeah.
He was a proponent of functionalism, which shifted the focus from the structure of consciousness to its function, how it helps us adapt to our environment and navigate the world.
So instead of trying to break down consciousness into its basic parts, James was more interested in understanding how it works in the real world.
Yeah.
It's like he was looking at the practical applications of consciousness.
Yeah, exactly.
How it enables us to survive and thrive.
Exactly. He was interested in questions like, what is the purpose of consciousness? How does it help us learn and solve problems? How does it guide our behavior?
It seems like a more pragmatic approach.
Yeah.
Less concerned with analyzing the mind in isolation and more focused on understanding how it operates within the context of our lives.
Right.
So we have Wundt, the father of experimental psychology, focusing on the structure of consciousness,
Yeah.
and James, a champion of functionalism, emphasizing the purpose and adaptive value of consciousness.
Right.
It's interesting to see how these different perspectives shape the early development of psychology.
It's a testament to the complexity of the human mind and the many ways we can approach its study.
Yeah.
And from these early beginnings, psychology has branched out into numerous subfields,
Right.
from clinical psychology and developmental psychology to social psychology and cognitive neuroscience.
It's amazing to see how much the field has grown and diversified over the years.
It really is.
And it's all thanks to those early pioneers who dared to ask the big questions and to explore the inner workings of the human mind.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the psychology book, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the overall impact of psychology on our understanding of ourselves and the world.
That's a big question, but I think it's safe to say that psychology has revolutionized the way we view ourselves and the world around us. It's given us a deeper understanding of human behavior, motivation, and emotion.
Right.
It's helped us develop more effective ways to treat mental illness, improve relationships, and foster personal growth.
It's like psychology has provided us with a whole new set of lenses through which to view the world, a new vocabulary to describe our inner experiences, and a more nuanced understanding of what it means to be human.
Beautifully put. Psychology has illuminated the hidden workings of the mind,
Yeah.
revealing the complexities of thought, feeling, and behavior. And this knowledge has empowered us to live more fulfilling lives, build stronger relationships, and create a more just and compassionate world.
What an inspiring thought, and I think that's a perfect note to end on.
It is.
Expert speaker, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the world of psychology.
It was my pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure exploring these fascinating ideas with you.
Likewise.
And to our listeners, I encourage you to continue exploring the world of psychology.
Yes.
There's always more to learn, more to discover, and more to understand about this incredible thing we call the human mind.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the psychology book. We hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as we have. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the fascinating world of the human mind.